The note was still in her hand when the carriage wheels stopped crunching on the gravel drive. Cecily Hartwell stood in the entry hall of the Dower House and listened to the sound of the horses being turned, listened to the coachman's quiet word to the lead animal, listened to the 4 miles of road that now lay between her and Ashmore Hall, and she read the note a third time because she was not yet certain she had understood it correctly the first 2. It was written on Ashmore Hall stationery. The seal at the bottom bore the Erickson crest. The hand was not James's hand, but his solicitor's, a careful, sloping script that used formal address throughout, as if formality might cushion what it was conveying. The note thanked Miss Hartwell for her service to the household. It wished her every future comfort. It confirmed that the allowance associated with her new station would be conveyed to her at the Dower House by quarterly arrangement. It did not say the word wife. It did not say anything that would have required James, the Duke of Ashmore, to acknowledge that the previous day had been his wedding day, and that the woman he was corresponding with through his solicitor was the woman he had married in the chapel at 10 o'clock in the morning. The coachman's voice faded. The wheels crunched again, retreating now, and Cecily listened to them go until she could no longer hear them. And then she stood in the silence and the entry hall, and the thin November light falling through an uncurtained window, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has expected very little and been given exactly that no one was coming back for her. She had been 22 years old for 3 weeks. She folded the note along its original crease, placed it in her coat pocket, and turned to find the housekeeper. She had arrived at Ashmore Hall 11 weeks earlier, in the last warm days of September, when the park's elm trees were still full, and the gravel drive was soft with recent rain, and the household's expectations of her were simple enough to be written in a single sentence. She was to be governess to Lady Nora Erickson, the Duke of Ashmore's 7-year-old ward, and she was to make herself as useful and as invisible as the position required. Cecily had arrived with 2 trunks, £32 per year, and the education her father had given her before the consumption took him, which was a better education than most men in the county possessed, and which she had learned, through the preceding 18 months of service in 3 households, to carry quietly and without exhibition. She knew Latin and mathematics and 2 modern languages and the history of the Italian painters. She knew not to say so at the servants' table, and not to say so in the drawing-room. And she had become, in the space of those 18 months, very skilled at the particular discipline of seeming to know less than she knew. The first morning at Ashmore Hall, she met Nora. The child was 7 years old and small for it, with dark hair and James's gray eyes, and she sat at the schoolroom table with her hands flat on the surface, and her spine arranged with a correctness that a child does not arrive at naturally. Someone had taught Nora to hold still in a way that suggested stillness was her only defense. Cecily recognized it immediately, having practiced the same art herself. She sat down across from the child and did not ask the scheduled questions about French vocabulary or history dates. She asked instead whether Nora preferred horses or dogs, and why. Nora looked at her for a long, assessing moment before she said, with some care, that she preferred cats, because a cat will only stay near you if it genuinely wishes to. Cecily had thought, privately, that this was the most accurate observation she had heard in some time. She said so. The child's spine lost approximately half an inch of its manufactured correctness. It was the beginning of something. Lady Dorothea Erickson, the Dowager Duchess, received Cecily in the drawing-room that same afternoon, seated by the fire with her hands in her lap and her jewels catching the light with the particular deliberateness of jewels worn in the morning to establish a point. She was 61 years old and precise about it, a woman for whom the social order was not an arrangement she had accepted, but a thing she had helped construct over 4 decades. and she looked at Cecily with the frank assessment of someone examining a piece of household furniture for defects. "Miss Hartwell," she said, in a voice that placed the name very carefully in a certain category. "James requires someone adequate for the child's lessons. I trust you will prove adequate." It was not a question. Cecily understood that it was not a question, and responded accordingly. She stayed. The Duke of Ashmore returned from London 8 days after Cecily's arrival. She heard the horses in the courtyard from the schoolroom window, heard the footman, heard a single authoritative exchange between James and his steward, Mr. Cartwright, and then she did not hear James again for 2 days because he did not come to the schoolroom and she did not go where he was. When she finally encountered him, it was in the first-floor corridor at 7:30 in the morning, and he was dressed for riding, and she was carrying Nora's French primer and a cup of tea that she had brought up from the kitchen herself because the housemaid had been unwell. He stopped. She stopped. He was tall and lean and dark-haired and 34 years old, and his face was the kind of face that had been handsome before something had taken the warmth out of it, leaving the structure intact, and the animation absent. His eyes were gray, the same gray as Nora's, and they moved over her once with an efficiency that was not unkind, but was not welcoming either. "Miss Hartwell," he said. It was the same name his mother had used, spoken in the same register of acknowledgement that did not quite become recognition. "Your Grace," she said. He continued down the corridor. She continued toward the schoolroom. The tea was still warm when she arrived. She told herself she had expected no different. This was not precisely true, but it was near enough to function. The weeks turned. Nora's French improved. Cecily began reading aloud to her in the evenings, first history, then poetry, and the child began asking questions that went considerably beyond what the curriculum required, which Cecily considered the most reliable sign of an awakened mind. She answered all of them. She also noticed that the portrait in James's study, visible when the door stood open in the mornings, had been turned face to the wall. She did not ask about it. It was not her portrait and not her study and not her business. But she noticed. She had been at Ashmore Hall for 3 weeks when Lady Dorothea corrected Nora in front of the assembled household at the Sunday dinner table. The correction concerned the child's posture, delivered in the carrying voice Lady Dorothea reserved for instructions she intended everyone present to hear, and Nora received it as she received all corrections from the dowager, which was to draw her shoulders up and her chin down, and to look at the plate in front of her with the particular fixity of someone who has discovered that disappearing into a piece of china is a valid survival strategy. Cecily had set down her fork. She had said, in a voice she kept level and courteous and precisely loud enough to be heard by everyone at the table, that Nora's posture in the schoolroom was a matter she was attending to herself, and that the child was making progress at a rate that reflected well on her industry, and that perhaps Lady Dorothea might observe a lesson on Tuesday if she wished to be assured of it. The silence at the table was considerable. She did not know that James was standing in the doorway of the dining room, having returned from the stables 5 minutes early. She did not know that he had stopped in the doorway rather than entering. She did not know that he stood there for the full duration of the silence, and watched her hold Lady Dorothea's gaze with the steady composure of someone who is frightened and has decided that the fright is less important than the child. She did not know any of this. She was watching Nora. Nora lifted her chin from the plate, a ½ inch, then a full one. James sat down at the head of the table and asked Cartwright about the Northfield drainage. The conversation moved. The moment passed. Cecily picked up her fork and ate the rest of her dinner and told herself she had done what needed doing, and that was sufficient. She did not know that James had not moved until she moved first. Lady Dorothea waited 1 week before she spoke to James privately about the governess. Cecily did not hear the conversation. She learned its contents only later, by inference and by the events the conversation produced. But she understood, in that particular way of someone who has learned to read a household's weather by its small signs, that something had been decided at her expense. The mechanism by which Lady Dorothea forced the marriage of convenience was, in its way, elegant. She had arranged for Cecily to be seen alone with James in the library at an hour that, under the season's social mathematics, required either a wedding or a permanent departure. Whether this was calculation or happenstance, Cecily never established to her own satisfaction. What she established was that the choice James was given was presented as the household's necessity, and that he accepted it with the same efficiency with which he addressed all necessities, which was to say, completely, and without visible feeling. He came to find her in the schoolroom the following morning, and told her, in 3 sentences, what Lady Dorothea had arranged and what the solution to it was. He did not ask her opinion. He did not, precisely, tell her she had no choice. He simply stated the situation as he understood it, and waited, with his hands behind his back and his face arranged in its habitual discipline, for her answer. She asked one question. She asked whether the marriage would give her a legal right to remain at Ashmore and continue as Nora's guardian, in fact, if not in title. He said yes. She said she would agree to the arrangement. He said he would speak to the vicar. He turned to go, and then stopped with his hand on the schoolroom doorframe, and without turning back, he said, in a slightly altered register that she could not quite categorize, that she should know he intended to honor the arrangement properly, and that she would not find herself worse situated than she was at present. She said, to his back, that she asked for nothing beyond what he had offered. He left. She sat down in the schoolroom chair and put her hands in her lap, and looked at the elm trees in the park for a long time without seeing them. If the listener wishes to stay with Cecily through what follows, simply remain. The story does not intend to spare her, or you. The wedding took place 5 days later in the Ashmore Hall Chapel, which was a small stone room at the east end of the house, lit by 3 windows and a row of candles on the altar. The vicar was Mr. Aldous Carew, a quiet man who had baptized James and buried James's father, and who performed the service with the gravity the occasion deserved, regardless of what had produced it. Lady Dorothea sat in the front pew and kept her hands in her lap. Cartwright and the head housekeeper, Mrs. Prewitt, served as witnesses, as was the custom when the household was the party. Cecily wore the better of her 2 good dresses, which was blue wool with white trim that she had re-sewn once at the neck, and which did not in any way resemble a wedding gown, and was not intended to. James wore his customary dark coat, and said his vows in the same level declarative voice he used to discuss the Northfield drainage. At the chapel threshold, waiting for the vicar to finish lighting the altar candles, she had stood beside James in the cold air of the doorway, and noticed the way the candle nearest to her trembled in the draught, and she had moved slightly, reflexively, to shelter it with her hand, and James had moved at the same moment, with the same intention. And their hands had arrived at the same small flame together, and then arrested there, 1/2 inch apart, neither of them withdrawing. She heard him breathe. She felt the warmth of him alongside the warmth of the flame. She did not look at him. The candle steadied. They went inside. At dinner, which Lady Dorothea attended without apparent alteration to her habits, James issued the only instruction he gave Cecily that evening, which was that she should eat something. She had eaten very little since the arrangement had been made, a fact she had not imagined was visible. She was apparently wrong about this. Later, standing in the corridor outside the bedchamber she had been given, which was the Duchess's rooms and smelled of cedar and old lavender, she heard him pause outside the door. He did not knock. The pause was long enough to be deliberate, and short enough to be deniable, and she stood on her side of the door, with her hand near the latch and her heart louder than she wished, and he moved on down the corridor, and she stood there in the quiet, and could not have said whether she was relieved or not. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she found the note. Not from James. From Mr. Aldous Crane, the family solicitor, whose careful sloping hand had informed her that arrangements had been made for her comfort at the Dower House, and that a carriage would arrive at 10 o'clock. She had not packed her own trunks. She had not had time to think about packing them. Mrs. Prewitt had sent 2 of the housemaids, and the thing was accomplished with quiet efficiency, and Cecily had stood in the corridor where James had paused the night before, and looked at the door of his study, and decided she would not knock, because a woman who requires the mercy of not being sent away should not have to ask for it, and because she had asked for nothing beyond what he had offered, and had meant it, and intended to be believed. She did not knock. She walked down the main staircase and into the entrance hall and into the carriage. Nora was at her French lesson. Cecily had asked Mrs. Prewitt to tell the child that she would write. Mrs. Prewitt had looked at her with an expression Cecily chose not to interpret. The carriage arrived at the Dower House 4 miles away at 10:30, and Cecily stood in the entry hall with Crane's note in her hand and listened to the wheels retreating, and she understood that she had been sent away the morning after her wedding by a man who had perhaps never, not for a single moment, noticed that she was worth keeping. She had been almost certain he had noticed. She had been wrong before. The Dower House was clean and adequately furnished, and 4 miles from anyone she cared about. She organized her 2 trunks. She learned the names of the Dower House's small staff. A cook named Mrs. Fenwick, a housemaid named Agnes, a stable boy named Will who was 13 years old and intensely serious about horses. She ate her meals at the correct hours. She read from the Dower House's modest library, which contained mostly agricultural volumes and 3 novels that someone had left face down and never retrieved. She was there 11 days before she understood she could not disappear entirely and maintain her own sense of herself. And she sat down at the Dower House's small writing desk and wrote a letter. She addressed it to Nora. Not to James. Not to Mrs. Prewitt or Cartwright or anyone at Ashmore Hall who might convey its existence to James as a form of petition. She wrote to the child because the child deserved to know that she had not left voluntarily, and that the French irregular verbs waited for her, and that she had found, at the Dower House, a tabby cat who lived in the kitchen and who stayed near her in the evenings when she read, which Cecily thought Nora would regard as a reliable sign. She sealed it and gave it to Will to carry. At Ashmore Hall, 11 days earlier, James had stood at his study window and watched the carriage take the south road toward the Dower House, and he had told himself this was the correct and decent arrangement. The woman had come as a governess and been placed, through no fault of her own, in a position that had altered her circumstances considerably and without her consent. The Dower House gave her independence and an income and a legal standing that her previous position had not. He had given her something, not taken something from her. This was what he told himself. He turned from the window. The portrait on the study wall, the one he had turned face inward 3 months ago after the news from his solicitor about his former steward Fenwick, who had forged his signature on a loan agreement and disappeared with £1,400 of Ashmore money and what James had believed was a friendship of 12 years' standing, looked back at him from its turned position as a rectangle of canvas and frame. He had not been able to look at it. He had not been able to look at almost anything that required trusting his own reading of a person's character, because his reading of Fenwick had been entirely wrong, and he had not known it for 12 years. He had been 22 when Fenwick came to Ashmore. He had trusted him the way a young man trusts someone who seems to see him clearly, which is the most expensive form of trust there is. By the time he was 34, and Fenwick was gone, The calculation had cost him the £1,400 and something harder to name, which was the conviction that his own perception of people was reliable. He had replaced that conviction with distance. Distance was safer than perception. Distance could not be forged. He had told himself, when Cecily agreed to the arrangement and asked only about Nora, that he was reading her correctly. She wanted the child and the legal standing and the dower house income, and that was rational and reasonable and nothing more than what the arrangement promised. He had told himself this and believed it. By the third day after her departure, Nora had stopped speaking at meals. Not entirely. She answered direct questions. She said please and thank you with her correct posture and her careful face. She ate what was placed before her. But the particular quality of her presence at the table, which had shifted in the preceding weeks from endurance to something that had almost resembled ease, was gone. She was back inside herself the way she had been in September, spine arranged like a defense, eyes on the china. James asked her, on the fourth day, what she would like to do after her lessons. She said, without looking up, that it did not much matter. He sat with that answer longer than a meal required. On the seventh day, he went to the schoolroom to look at what she had been working on. The French primer was open to the chapter on irregular verbs. Nora had written the conjugations in her careful hand, and at the bottom of the page, in the margin, in handwriting that was smaller than Nora's and neater, Cecily had made a small annotation in pencil, a note about the verb partir, which means to leave. Cecily had written, in French and then in English, the distinction between leaving that is chosen and leaving that is done to you, and that the verb in either case looks the same on the page, which is one of the things that makes French worth learning. He stood in the schoolroom for a long time. On the ninth day, he went to his study and reached up and turned the portrait around. It was his father's study portrait, painted when the old Duke was 38, and it had the family gray eyes and the family jaw, and it looked out from the canvas with the particular directness of someone who had done his accounts and found them in order, and had nothing to apologize for. James had turned it away because looking at it had reminded him of Fenwick, who had stood in this room and complimented this portrait many times over 12 years. Now he looked at it and found that it did not remind him of Fenwick. It reminded him of Nora looking at the china and Cecily saying she would agree to the arrangement and asking only whether it gave her the right to stay near the child. He thought about what it had cost her to ask only that. He thought about what it meant that she had asked for nothing that she was not already providing to someone else. On the 10th day, Nora received a letter. He did not read it. He was not in the room when she opened it. He heard about it from Mrs. Prewitt, who reported, with the careful neutrality of a housekeeper who has opinions she has decided are not her place, that Lady Nora had read the letter 3 times during the afternoon and had taken it to bed with her and had spoken at supper about an apparently notable tabby cat residing at the dower house. On the 11th day, while James was deciding what to do and how to do it without making a worse error than the one he had already made, Lady Dorothea acted. She had invited Miss Philippa Vane to the winter assembly at Ashmore Hall, which was the county's principal social occasion of the November season, held in the Ashmore Ballroom, attended by every family of consequence within 20 miles. Miss Vane was the younger daughter of the Viscount Fairholme, 20 years old, polished, positioned, and possessed of the kind of beauty that the county's marriage machinery had been calibrated specifically to reward. Lady Dorothea had placed her at her own right hand in the drawing-room before the assembly, and she had distributed the necessary information to the necessary people with the efficiency of someone who has managed social logistics for 40 years and knows exactly which 3 conversations must occur before the general understanding settles. The understanding she was distributing was that the Duke of Ashmore's recent arrangement was a matter of convenience only, that the girl at the Dower House was very comfortable and entirely compensated for her service, and that the Duke of Ashmore was, naturally, free to make a more suitable connection at any time that the law and good sense permitted. She was, that is to say, informing the county that the marriage did not count. Cecily received a second note from Crane that afternoon, delivered by one of the Ashmore Hall footmen who arrived at the Dower House door, looking as though he had been instructed to say nothing and intended to honor that instruction. The note advised her, in the same careful, sloping hand, that her attendance at the Ashmore Winter Assembly was not expected or required, and that she should feel entirely at liberty to remain comfortable at the Dower House. She read it twice. She put it in the same coat pocket as the first note. She had not intended to attend the assembly. She had no gown for an assembly. She had the blue wool dress and one other, which was gray with a retrimmed hem, and she was the governess who had been married and sent away in the same 24 hours, and she had not, in 11 days, shed a single tear about it, which she considered either her greatest accomplishment or her most significant failure, and she was not yet certain which. She sat at the writing desk for a long time with her hands flat on the surface, and then she straightened her spine the way Nora had been taught to straighten hers, and she went to find Mrs. Fenwick and ask whether the Dower House kitchen had produced anything for supper. The winter assembly began at 7 o'clock. James had been in the Ashmore ballroom since the first guests arrived, standing near the window that overlooked the park, where the first snow of the season had begun to fall in the late afternoon and now lay thin and white across the gravel and the elm trees. He had spoken to Cartwright and to 3 neighboring landowners and to the magistrate, Sir Frederick Poole, who had known his father and who always found something useful to say about the weather. He had watched his mother install Miss Vane at her right hand, and he had watched the room rearrange its understanding of the situation in the way that a room always does when the dowager signals her intentions clearly. He had let it happen for 45 minutes. Miss Vane was positioned near the fireplace, where the light was best, in a gown of deep green silk that someone had made very deliberately, and Lady Dorothea was introducing her to the county's interested parties with the unhurried satisfaction of someone who believes the matter is already resolved. The matter was not resolved. The matter had been resolved 11 days ago in a stone chapel with 3 windows and a candle in a draught, and the resolution was legal and binding and had been witnessed by the Ashmore housekeeper and the estate steward and a vicar who had been performing marriages for 30 years and knew the difference between a valid ceremony and a social arrangement. James crossed the ballroom. He crossed it at the pace that his rank and his 4-inch advantage in height over most of the room permitted, which was to say directly and without detour, and the room had 20 years of practice in getting out of his way when he chose to move, and it did so now. Lady Dorothea saw him coming when he was 12 feet away. He saw her see him. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, a question she had not expected to be asked this evening. And then he was at her side. He did not look at Miss Vane. He looked at his mother. He said, in the level, declarative voice that had closed 100 conversations about estate drainage and legal matters and the management of difficulties, "I require Crane." Lady Dorothea said, in a voice that held its composure by a very narrow margin, "James, this is Miss Vane, who has been kind enough to join us for the assembly." "I am aware of who Miss Vane is," he said. "I require Crane." Aldous Crane was located near the supper-room door, where he had spent the evening with a glass of wine and the expression of a man who has been carrying a procedural error in his coat pocket for 11 days and is very tired of it. He came forward when James looked at him, and his face had the quality of someone who has already decided what he is about to say. James let him say it. Crane addressed the immediate circle, which had expanded in the preceding 30 seconds as the room's attention reorganized itself the way rooms always do when the most powerful person in them stops moving toward nothing and starts moving toward something specific. He said that he owed a correction to the household and to the county. He said that his 2 notes to Miss Hartwell, now the Duchess of Ashmore, had been issued on the basis of standing household instructions that predated the marriage and had not been updated to reflect it, which was a procedural error that was his alone, and for which he apologized without qualification. Lady Dorothea said nothing. This was for her an unusual condition. James turned to the room and did what he should have done 11 days ago in a corridor instead of moving away down it. He said, without preamble and without decoration, addressing the assembled county in the same level voice, "My wife is at the Dower House. I intend to bring her home." He said it once. He did not repeat it or elaborate upon it. The sentence stood in the ballroom the way a very old and solid thing stands, not requiring support. Miss Vane, possessed of considerably more grace than the situation demanded, turned slightly away and found a conversation that did not require her to arrange her face. Lady Dorothea's fan was very still. James was already at the door. The snow had thickened in the hour since the assembly began, and the road to the Dower House was 4 miles of elm-lined track under 2 inches of fresh white, and James rode it rather than taking the carriage, because a carriage requires turning and waiting, and he was not, at this particular moment, prepared to do either. He arrived at the Dower House at 8:30, and the lights were burning in the parlor windows, and he gave his horse to Will, who received it with the intense seriousness he brought to all horse-related transactions, and he went to the front door. He knocked. Mrs. Fenwick opened the door and looked at him with an expression that contained no surprise whatsoever, which he noted and would have appreciated more under different circumstances. She told him Miss Hartwell was in the parlor, and she stood back, and he went in. Cecily was at the writing desk. She was not writing. She had both of Crane's notes on the desk in front of her, smoothed flat, and the tabby cat was on the windowsill regarding the snow with professional detachment, and the fire in the small parlor hearth was doing a reasonable job, and she looked up when he came in with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a thing they have told themselves they are not waiting for. He stood in the doorway of the parlor. He was cold from the road, and there was snow in his hair that had not yet melted. And he looked at her across the width of the small room, and he said, without preamble, because preamble was not available to him, "I made an error." She said quietly, "I know." He said, "I sent you here because I thought distance was the correct and merciful thing. I was wrong." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone who has been deciding whether to say this for 11 days, "You sent me here because you did not trust your own reading of what you saw, and what you saw was someone who stayed near the child and wanted nothing from you but the right to do so." He was very still. "You saw it," she said. "You simply could not believe that what you saw was true." The fire settled. The tabby cat turned from the window and considered him with the neutrality that Nora had correctly identified as reliability. He crossed the room and picked up the 2 notes from the desk and folded them together along their creases and put them in his own coat pocket, which was not a legally significant act, but was a legible one. He said, in a voice that had lost some of the discipline it normally maintained, "I would like you to come home." She said, "I know." A pause, very brief. "I should like that as well." She reached for her coat. The carriage was called rather than the horse, because Cecily was not going to ride 4 miles in the snow in wool, and James sat across from her in the carriage, with his hands on his knees, and said very little for the first mile. Then he said, because it seemed necessary to say it without decoration, that the portrait in the study had been his father's, and that he had turned it away after a man he trusted had betrayed the trust entirely, and that looking at it had become, in the month since, a reminder that his judgment of people was not to be relied upon. She listened without moving. He said that when he had turned it back, 9 days after she left, the portrait had looked at him the same way it always had, and had not reminded him of Fenwick at all. It had reminded him of a woman who stood up for a child at a dinner table and asked, when offered a marriage, only whether the marriage gave her the right to stay near the child. She said after a moment, "That is the sort of thing that tends to be reliable." He looked at her across the carriage. Something in the structure of his face shifted, not the architecture of it, which was its own and permanent, but the animation, the quality of his attention, which arrived in his eyes without apology, and stayed there. "Yes," he said. "It is." Ashmore Hall was lit in the upper floors, and Nora was, according to all correct rules and regulations, in bed asleep. These were the facts as Mrs. Prewitt delivered them at the front door, and she delivered them while holding the door open and looking at Cecily with an expression that was, for Mrs. Prewitt, remarkably close to warmth. The hall was warm and smelled of the coal fire in the east grate and the faint cedar from the linen press on the first landing. Cecily stood in it and felt, for the first time in 11 days, the particular quality of not being 4 miles from anywhere she cared about. Nora was not, in fact, in bed asleep. She was on the first-floor landing in her nightgown, with her hair in its plait and the letter in her hand, and she had heard the carriage, and she had come to the top of the stairs, and she looked down at Cecily in the hall with the gray eyes that were James's eyes in a 7-year-old face, and her spine had entirely abandoned its manufactured correctness. She came down the stairs at a pace that no governess would have sanctioned, and arrived at the bottom with her arms around Cecily's waist before anyone could speak. Cecily put her hands on the child's shoulders and held her there, and the letter crinkled between them and the tabby cat's counterpart, the Ashmore Hall kitchen tabby, who had also decided that the cold open hall was now the correct place to be, threaded around both their ankles. Mrs. Prewitt took Nora back upstairs with a firmness that made concessions to the sentiment of the occasion, and therefore took slightly longer than a purely administrative escort would have required. Nora said, from the top of the stairs, that the Dower House tabby had better come to Ashmore Hall because otherwise it would be alone, which was the sort of thing that requires a considered reply, and Cecily said she thought that could very likely be arranged. James, beside her in the hall, made a sound that was almost not the sound he usually made. She thought, and was fairly sure she was not wrong, that it was something like relief, expressed in a register that had very little practice with relief. She went up to the Duchess's rooms. The cedar and lavender smell was unchanged. The window looked north toward the park where the elm trees stood under their coat of snow, and she stood at the glass for a moment and looked at the white-covered grounds and thought that this was a very large house to have been sent away from, and that she did not intend to permit it to happen again, and that she was fairly well equipped to ensure that it did not. The study door was open when she passed it in the morning. The portrait was upright on the wall, and the old Duke looked out from the canvas with the same direct gray eyes, and the coal fire in the study grate was burning against the December cold, and James was at the desk writing something, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He did not say Miss Hartwell. He did not say Your Grace, or any other formality that the corridor might have required. He said her name, simply, as though he had been waiting to use it correctly, and had now decided the wait was finished. "Cecily," he said. She came in. The snow was still falling beyond the study window. Somewhere upstairs, Nora was at the schoolroom table with the French premier, and the page on irregular verbs had one small margin annotation in pencil and 2 new ones in a child's careful hand, the kind of additions that accumulate in a book that is being actively used and returned to and used again. The fire in the study grate said its steady thing. The portrait said nothing, as portraits do, and looked out at the room with its patient gray clarity. Cecily sat down in the chair across the desk. The snow kept falling. The house settled around her like a thing that had always known she was coming, and had been keeping the chair warm. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments and stay a little longer. There are more stories waiting, and every one of them begins with a woman who was told she did not count.